Let's talk about three neighbors. We're talking about countries that share borders, billions of people, and a really complicated history. But you know what's wild? The most surprising thing they share is an almost identical starting line in their modern economic journeys. How their paths split apart? Well, that's a story that basically reshaped the world.
So, right around the middle of the 20th century, all three of these nations kind of burst onto the world scene at roughly the same time. Each one was a new country, and they all faced this absolutely enormous task of building a future for hundreds of millions of people pretty much from scratch.
And that's the big question we're tackling here. Because even though they started together, their paths went in wildly different directions. The story of why is just a masterclass in strategy, risk, and, well, nation building. All right, let's get into it.
To really get a handle on where they ended up, you have to go right back to the beginning. And what's so fascinating is just how similar their early years were. It's actually kind of uncanny.
I mean, you can't really overstate how close this was. We're talking about a tiny window of just 2 years. You've got India and Pakistan in 1947, and then the People's Republic of China pops up in 1949. They all stepped onto the world stage at virtually the same moment.
And their first playbook? Almost identical. Central planning was the name of the game. So India kicked off its first 5-year plan in 1951, China followed suit in 53, and then Pakistan in 56. In all three places, the government was firmly in the driver's seat, telling the economy where to go.
And get this, for the next 30 years, their stories stayed pretty much in lockstep. You look at the growth rates, the per capita income, they were all running a very similar race. If you were a betting person looking at their economies in 1980, you would have had a hard time picking a clear winner, which makes what happened next all the more incredible.
Because it was in the late 20th century that these nations started making these huge, country-altering bets on policy. And those bets, they would change absolutely everything. China went first, and they went big with a truly radical idea called the Great Leap Forward. The goal was insane: to industrialize a massive farming nation almost instantly. People were actually encouraged to build little steel furnaces in their backyards, and farms were totally reorganized into these giant collective communes.
But this leap came at a staggering, absolutely tragic cost. The disruption to farming, combined with a terrible drought, led to a catastrophic famine. The estimated death toll was around 30 million people. It was just a brutal, horrifying lesson in the dangers of top-down, rushed reform.
So having learned from that disaster, China's next big move in 1978 was completely different. It was careful. It was methodical. First up, they reformed agriculture, basically giving land back to individual families. This one move created a huge boom in rural incomes. Then they moved on to industry, allowing private companies to compete. And finally, they threw open the doors to the world with these special economic zones.
Now, what were India and Pakistan doing all this time? Well, they chose a much more cautious path. They both went for a mixed economy model, part state-controlled, part private. They focused on social spending and, in Pakistan's case, on something called import substitution, which basically just means trying to make stuff at home instead of buying it from other countries. Their story was one of steady, gradual change, not radical revolution.
Okay, so to recap, you've got one country that took a huge, painful risk and then course-corrected with this really smart, phased revolution. And then you have two others that stuck to a steadier, more regulated path. So, let's look at the results.
And yeah, the results on this slide really do speak for themselves. The numbers are just mind-boggling. China's economy, at around $35 trillion, is more than double the size of India's. And India's economy is about 10 times the size of Pakistan's. The gap is just immense.
Now, what's so interesting about this slide is it shows you exactly when that massive split started. In the 1980s, right after those reforms, China's economy just exploded, growing at over 10% a year. And fun fact, at the time, Pakistan was actually growing faster than India, but neither of them could even touch the pace China was setting.
So how in the world did China pull off that explosive growth? This slide pretty much gives you the answer. They nailed the classic economic transition, moving millions and millions of people from the farm to the factory. While a huge chunk of the workforce in India and Pakistan stayed in agriculture, China built a world-beating industrial sector that now makes up almost 40% of its entire economy.
And look, this isn't just a story about money, it's a human story. Take a critical health indicator like infant mortality. China's rate is now incredibly low, right down there with many fully developed countries.
It just goes to show that those economic gains translated directly into real, life-saving improvements for its people.
So we've seen the what, but now we really need to dig into the why. Why was China's strategy so uniquely, incredibly successful?
Well, here's the secret sauce. It wasn't just the 1978 reforms. It was the foundation that had been laid in the decades before them. Even under Mao, China had made these huge strides in basic rural healthcare and education. And crucially, they also had a system of decentralized planning, which meant local officials already had experience running their own little economies. China didn't build its economic rocket on an empty launch pad. The groundwork was already there.
And this quote right here, it just nails their method. After the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, China didn't bet the whole farm on one single idea again. Instead, they experimented. They would test out policies in one province, see if it worked, and only then would they roll it out across the whole country. It was a strategy of being cautiously bold.
In contrast, many scholars point to persistent political instability as a major roadblock for Pakistan. With frequent changes in government, it's just really hard to stick to a long-term economic plan. And because of that, the country really struggled to build on the growth it had in the 80s, and some key indicators actually went backwards.
So after tracing these three incredible, continent-sized journeys, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from these giant experiments and how to build a nation? To me, 4 key lessons really stand out. First, invest in your people, right from the start. Basic health and education are the absolute bedrock of success. Second, political stability matters a lot. Constant chaos makes long-term growth nearly impossible. Third, that jump from the farm to the factory, building a strong industrial sector, is a crazy, powerful engine for growth. And fourth, don't be afraid to experiment, but do it smartly. Test things out. And that brings us to our final thought for today. History has shown us how these different strategies played out in the 20th century. But as we all face brand new challenges, climate change, huge demographic shifts, new technology, the real question is, which model, or maybe some new combination of them, is best equipped for the century to come?